Over the years, Monday Night Raw has been home to some of the greatest runs in wrestling history. Think Stone Cold Steve Austin at the turn of the millennium, Shawn Michaels in the 2000s, or Cody Rhodes today if you need any evidence of this. That said, for every good period a performer spent on the red brand, there have been equally bad times for others. But who has had the worst runs in Raw history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. And where better to start than with Triple H and his reign of terror? Yes, where else could we start with this topic other than the period between 2002 and 2005 when the game spent 3 years trying to turn himself into Harley Race? And the way he did this was by growing out a handlebar mustache and burying everyone who fell in his path. It didn't matter if it was Rob Van Dam, Goldberg, Kane, Chris Jericho, Scott Steiner, or perhaps most infamously Booker T. Anyone who challenged Paul Levesque at this point in time came out of the situation looking worse for wear. And given that he was the lead character of Raw at that point, it pretty much made Monday nights unwatchable for a period, as it was inevitable every week would begin with an excessive 20-minute promo from him, all before he then nuked the career of someone new. Sure, there were brief highlights such as the comedy brilliance of his blindfold match with D'Lo Brown, or the fact that he eventually put over Batista strong, but those were only small diamonds in a mountain of rough. But why did it all have to happen this way at all? Well, that's a matter of speculation, but one of the more popular theories is that with Steve Austin and The Rock both gone, Triple H saw this as his opportunity to elevate himself to their level at the cost of everyone else around him. Unfortunately though, for as great as the cerebral assassin is, no one outside of Hulk Hogan at his peak is on the level of Steve Austin or The Rock, something the Great One's recent appearances on SmackDown have reminded us all of. So, all the game's work in turning Monday nights into a dead zone ended up being for nothing then. All it did in fact was turn him into public enemy number one amongst fans for years, with it taking all the way up until he became the booker of NXT for things to really turn around in terms of public perception. Thank God he did this then, and the reign of terror can now become a memory of the past. We just hope the same redemption can one day come for our next subject too, as it was during her first run on Raw during the mid to late 2010s that she built up quite a persona for herself. Who are we talking about here? Why, Nia Jax, of course. And this persona was much worse than anything Triple H had, because as hated as the King of Kings was back then, there was one thing you could always say about him, and this was that he was an absolute professional in the ring. Hell, at one point, you could easily have argued he was the best wrestler in the world. When it comes to Nia Jax, though, her skills have never even approached this level. No, whenever she's hit the ring, particularly during that first run, she looked like a beginner at times. Not that this has to be a terrible thing, though. No, there are plenty of inexperienced wrestlers who have learned on the job. Take Jade Cargill in AEW, for example, or the majority of the roster of current-day NXT. But none of those performers had a habit of hurting people, and Jax most certainly did. Seriously, the amount of people she stepped in the ring with during this time and legitimately injured was actually quite scary. Obviously then, there were a lot of boos from fans watching on Monday nights, and calls for her to receive more training before she returned, as no one wanted to see any of their favorite performers get injured for real. But alas, this never happened, and so, over the years, Jax's body count would grow. Sure, sometimes that would have an unintentional positive effect, such as the time she concussed Becky Lynch and sent her ricocheting right into the WrestleMania main event. But that's not enough to excuse all the other times people were putting their lives in her hands and getting burned because of it. Hell, even wrestlers would take occasional shots at her online over this. But then, when you shoot injure big names on the Raw roster like Bayley, Charlotte Flair, Ember Moon, Kairi Sane, Mandy Rose, and Zelina Vega, that's to be expected after a while. We just hope now that she's returned, she's gotten safer in the ring, with this being something we're hopeful of, as there doesn't appear to have been any serious incidents since her comeback, outside of a bruised rib for Rhea Ripley and whiplash for Raquel Rodriguez. But let's move on from Nia Jax for now, and instead onto another infamously bad Raw run which happened right around the time she was leaving the company for the first time. And while this one didn't physically leave anyone injured, it certainly killed a few careers. That's right, it's time to talk about Retribution. Where do we start with Retribution? The group that was clearly supposed to be the next NWO, but which ended up coming across more like a bad version of the Putty Patrol from the Power Rangers. It's honestly hard to imagine how someone could have created something this bad. Basically, it all started when, back in August of 2020, right as the company was in the midst of the Thunderdome era, they decided they needed to try to boost interest in the show. And so that was why they, at this point, introduced a new stable of performers who, tired of being overlooked, attempted to take over the show. The only problem, though, was that while this initial attack may have had something to it, any goodwill it built up was instantly washed away when on the September 21st episode of Raw, the group formally introduced themselves. How would they introduce themselves then? Well, by coming out to the ring in bad Halloween masks and announcing that their names were Mace, Slapjack, T-Bar, Reckoning, and Retaliation. And it wasn't like it had to be this way either, because if they just let the performers involved be who they were, with those performers being Dio Madden, Shane Haste, Dominic Dijak, Mia Yim, and Mercedes Martinez, as they were all good wrestlers to varying degrees in their own rights. But during the latter days of Vince McMahon, fans had to put up with such questionable booking, and so what we got instead was Retribution spending the next couple of months appearing on Monday nights and always losing, something which only served to make them seem like less of an invading threat and more of a pesky bug to be swatted away. Really then, is it any surprise that only one of these performers is still on the main roster today, and that most have left the company overall to go find success elsewhere? After all, if this was the kind of thing you were being asked to do on Monday nights, would you even want to come to work? Hell, even when someone as talented as Mustafa Ali came on board as the group's secret leader, he was unable to fix things, a sign of just how dead in the water it already was by then. Of course, Retribution wasn't the only failed run to happen on Raw during the Thunderdome era, however, as around the same time, WWE were also causing another potentially good idea to flop hard with their terrible execution of it, and that's none other than Raw Underground. Sure, it was maybe never going to be an Emmy Award-winning segment or anything, but the base idea behind Raw Underground had something to it. After all, if fans weren't allowed to be in the arena, then the idea of turning the third hour of the show into an underground fight club which would make Tyler Durden proud was just as good of an option as any. The only problem, though, was that once it actually arrived on screen, Raw Underground ended up feeling less like a cool David Fincher movie and more like a headache. Sure, there were a few performers who appeared on it that had legit shoot skills, names like Dolph Ziggler, but they were never really the focus. No, the focus very quickly became the likes of Braun Strowman and Daba Kato, so it's no surprise this was something which wasn't particularly entertaining to watch then. But just imagine how entertaining it could have been had WWE gone all in with the idea and let it fully be led by people like Chad Gable, Otis, Matt Riddle, or Bobby Lashley. It could have been awesome. Sadly, however, that was not meant to be, and so instead Raw Underground will go down in history as one of the Red Brand's lowest points, one which ended up getting cancelled mere months later due to a combination of low fan interest and health and safety concerns. Still though, for as bad as this one was, you could argue it wasn't quite as bad as another era of Raw which came before it, the guest host era. That's right, Vince McMahon was always looking for new ways to make Raw more mainstream, even at the expense of upsetting his current fan base. And that's what led us to the guest host era. Yes, as you probably remember, this was the era characterized by Monday nights featuring a different celebrity guest host each week. That said, not all celebrity appearances are created equal, and so rather than reaching the highs of folks like Mr. T and Mike Tyson, most of what happened during this time was stuff like Jeremy Piven thinking SummerSlam was called Summerfest, or William Shatner trying to pretend like he'd ever watched a single episode of Raw in his life. That's not to say there weren't the occasional highlights, of course, such as when Bob Barker memorably hosted an episode of The Price is Right at the top of the entranceway. But for as good as this was, there were another dozen terrible hosts who did nothing but make the show that much more difficult to watch during the dead zone for WWE, which was 2009 and 2010. Maybe the lesson to be learned then is that if you're going to bring in a celebrity, make it someone who's a fan of the product or who has something to contribute, much like the way Bad Bunny and Logan Paul have done in today's era. After all, for as much heat as Logan gets, there's certainly an appeal to watching him have a match, the same of which cannot be said for someone like Ozzy Osbourne, Chris Angel, or Ricky Hatton. Seriously, what was a magician like Chris Angel doing on Raw in 2010? Was it a case of him wanting to magically travel to the past to change the run of our next subjects? Maybe so, but if he did, he'd have to go all the way back to 1998 and talk to Dr. Death Steve Williams. Now, for older wrestling fans, Dr. Death is nothing less than a bona fide legend of the industry. Someone who, after finding success in the world of football, tried his hand in the squared circle and there became a star in his own right, particularly in WCW and All Japan Pro Wrestling, with it being in the latter that he won the prestigious Triple Crown in 1994. So you'd think that with all this momentum behind him then, and with Jim Ross himself fighting his case within the offices of Stamford, Steve Williams would have been a shoo-in to become a megastar in WWF once he was signed up to a contract there, right as the Attitude Era was beginning. Unfortunately though, there was one thing standing in the way of his success, and that was bad booking. That's right. Well, the plan had always been for the Colorado native to come in looking strong right out of the gate by mowing through a group of mid-card talents, all en route towards getting a main event program with Steve Austin. It was the WWF booker Vince Russo's idea to attempt to utilize Dr. Death's real-life tough guy persona by having him take part in the Brawl for All. And that's where things went completely off the rails, as in this competition, which was contested under legitimate shoot-fight rules, Williams ended up getting knocked out by Bart Gunn in round 2, with such a move completely stopping his aura as a badass instantaneously. Sure, there were plenty of other bad things which came out of the Brawl for All too, but in terms of runs being absolutely stopped stone dead, no one suffered more damage than the former NWA Tag Team Champion, as now any hopes he had of that main event run with the Rattlesnake had disappeared. So because of this, when he did return to the ring again following this loss, he'd be hidden away in the undercard, having bouts against the likes of Hardcore Holly, Al Snow, or Tiger Ali Singh. So when his contract came up in 1999 then, Steve Williams would be only too happy to exit stage left and return to the places he found so much success in before. But really, things should have never gotten to the point where he had to do that. Just as it should never have gotten to the same point it got to with Bearcat Lee. Remember Bearcat Lee? You probably wish you didn't, because this was the gimmick Keith Lee was given when he joined the Raw roster in 2020. That's right, it's rare you see a performer with so much talent get botched so quickly on account of one bad gimmick. But here's a perfect example of it right in front of us all. But this is a shame, as if there was anyone who didn't need a silly gimmick to get over, then it was Keith Lee. No, all he needed to do to become a success on Monday nights was to do what he'd been doing on both the indie circuit and NXT prior to that, have awesome matches, which allowed him to show the freakish level of athleticism he had for a man his size. But alas, this was still the Vince McMahon era of WWE, and so instead of getting that version of the Wichita Falls native, he'd be given a character which was ripped straight out of the New Generation era, and which spelled instant burial for any hopes he had of becoming a main event force on Raw. And as if that weren't bad enough, WWE would then fire him a few months later once they felt like he wasn't getting over enough. And in the years since, he's moved over to AEW, where sadly, health issues and repeated injuries have meant that he's only been able to have a sporadic run there, doing little of note outside of, at one point, holding the tag team titles with Swerve Strickland. Could things still pick up for him in the future? We hope so. Just as we hope another former Raw superstar has a great run in him, and that's our next subject, Eric Rowan. Now, we know there were good times for Eric Rowan on Raw, specifically when he was part of the Wyatt family. But once that stable broke up and he was left to go solo towards the end of the 2010s, things took a severe downswing for him. Why is that? Well, after being drafted back over to the Red brand in the summer of 2019, he'd introduced a strange new gimmick which saw him carry a cage around everywhere, a cage which presumably had some kind of monstrous creature hidden within it. Obviously then, this failed to get over with fans and only made Rowan come across as even more mid-card than he'd been before. After all, this one seemed like an outdated gimmick to say the least. What Raw fans were begging for at this time was a change in creative direction, one which would spark interest in the product once more. And this gimmick, and the run which came along with it, was certainly not that. Hell, it wasn't even as if the reveal was anything special, as after spending weeks teasing, on the March 2nd, 2020 episode of the Red Brand, Rowan finally revealed what was inside of the cage, and this was a giant spider. Of course, this might have been scary had it not looked like a bad Halloween decoration, so maybe it's just as well that the following week then, Drew McIntyre crushed the poor beast with the steel ring steps while it was still locked inside of its cage, putting an end to the storyline once and for all. And only weeks after that, Eric Rowan's run would come to a conclusive end too, as he'd be part of yet another wave of mass releases. Of course, there were some people who were safe from the dreaded budget cuts that year, but then considering how much Michael Cole had improved since his heel run at the start of the 2010s, he had certainly earned his spot within the company by then. Back in 2010, however, this was the period when, following years of being badmouthed by fans for having to be the voice of WWE during its most bland period, Michael Cole had a further stake driven in his heart when he was asked to turn heel and become even more insufferable than before. That's right, if you thought it was bad hearing him call matches using Vince McMahon verbiage like local medical facility for the better part of a decade, then you hadn't seen anything yet, because now Cole was going to be doing all this as a heel. And that meant him adding to his repertoire by doing things like regularly arguing with his co-commentator Jerry Lawler during broadcasts, showing an over-the-top level of admiration for The Miz, or taking to protecting himself inside of his coal mine, a plexiglass booth situated at ringside. Basically, what we were saying here is that even by the standards of 2010 WWE, this was an especially terrible time for commentary. But still, it might not have been so bad had the voice of Raw limited things to the commentary booth. After all, fans could always hit mute, right? Well, not when he was lacing up his boots and hitting the ring himself they couldn't, with this being something he did on multiple occasions back then, most notably at WrestleMania 27 when he took up almost 20 minutes of airtime and even had the gall to win his match against the King via disqualification. Honestly, it's amazing Michael Cole was ever able to rehabilitate himself in the eyes of fans again following this, as it was so bad it would have ended many people's careers. But rehabilitate himself he did, because today, the Syracuse native is regarded for being one of the greatest announcers of all time. Certainly someone who was able to make the best out of a bad time being behind the booth while he had Vince McMahon shouting in his ear. In fact, even to this day, you can still hear Cole do his thing on Monday nights alongside Pat McAfee. We just hope Triple H doesn't decide to repeat history by turning him heel again then. And we also hope the game doesn't try to repeat another bad Raw run by bringing back Mojo Rawley and having him revive his terrible 2019 cracked face paint gimmick. What was this one? Well, back at the dawn of the 2020s, Mojo Rawley, upon deciding that being a babyface hype bro had gotten him nowhere fast, wanted to do something different in order to get himself noticed. And this different thing ended up being to wear some bad face paint and cut promos while staring into a cracked mirror for weeks. And we mean weeks, because the introduction to this new character just kept going on and on and on, with every episode of Raw he was featured in basically seeing him cut the same promo and do nothing more, as everything quickly grew stale. That said, maybe it would have been for the best in the long run if he had just kept to backstage segments forever with such a go-nowhere character, as when he finally did hit the ring with it properly in May of 2019, he'd immediately show himself to be just as much of a jobber as he was before. Yes, usually when a wrestler gets a gimmick change, it signifies that the company wants to do something with them, and so you can at least expect them to pick up a few victories in order to establish their new selves, but here, that didn't happen. No, instead all we got was Rawley doing job after job after job, with him pretty quickly being relegated to the level of the 24/7 title division, where all he did was become a part of a mob chasing R-Truth around backstage every week. Could things have been different? Maybe, if more care was given to doing something with the Virginia native following those bizarre initial vignettes. But again, this was an era of Raw where things were going downhill fast, and so Mojo became yet another victim of the bad booking that was ever present on Monday nights. Thankfully though, the booking has gotten a lot better in recent years, so hopefully we won't see anything else coming up soon which is bad enough to be listed in a future Worst of Raw video. But then, who knows? There's always the chance that even the game will create the occasional botched booking decision of his own that merits being labeled a Monday Night Nightmare.